conducted by the experts at Synapse Energy Economics and EQ Research, and it lays out a roadmap that can guide Pennsylvania to be 100% supported by clean and renewable energy by the year 2050, and will allow the state to be well on its way to that goal by as soon as the year 2030, leaving fossil fuels totally behind by the time we get to mid-century. The Delaware Riverkeeper Network commissioned this report because, pursuant to the Clean Power Plan rules out of the Environmental Protection Agency, rather than be a true energy leader, Pennsylvania is poised to further its commitment to dirty fossil fuels, particularly through more fracking and drilling for shale gas. And it is very clear to us from the facts and from the science that Pennsylvania's ongoing commitment to fracking is not fueled by a genuine need from an energy perspective, but really is fueled by the politics here in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. This report makes very clear that there is not a need for fracked gas in terms of powering the state of Pennsylvania, and it lays out a better path for the state to follow pursuant to the Clean Power Plan. We also believe that in addition to providing a roadmap for Pennsylvania, this report and all of the detailed technical analysis and discussion it includes also offers a vision that other states can draw from in creating their own truly clean energy strategies and clean power plans. So with that, I'd like to turn the microphone over to Patrick Knight of Synapse Energy Economics to talk with you about the report.
Thanks, Maya. So this is Pat Knight with Synapse Energy Economics, as Maya just said. First, you're going to be hearing from me talking a little bit about the analysis that was conducted within this report. And then I'm going to turn things over to Justin Barnes from EQ Research, who's going to talk a little bit more about the specific policies that we assessed. We've got everybody on the call on mute right now. We'll be unmuting folks at the end and allowing there to be a live Q&A session. So if you do have any questions, please write them down, and we'll be most definitely getting to them in just a couple of minutes. So first, to talk a little bit about the Envisioning Pennsylvania's Energy Future report. So Maya gave a great overview of it. This report is meant to examine a set of policies that result in zero carbon emissions by 2050 from Pennsylvania consumers. This report outlines plans for broader electrification, increased investment in renewables, and improvements to energy efficiency. And it offers guidance for developing a clean energy future in Pennsylvania that can serve as a model for states around the country. Our 100% renewable scenario would result in energy savings of $134 billion from 2015 to 2050, and $9 billion in electric bill and fuel cost savings in the year 2050 alone. Our scenario also finds a net increase of nearly 500,000 jobs over the same period. So first, what we're looking at here is a chart showing Pennsylvania's path forward to zero emissions. This chart shows the CO2 emissions in Pennsylvania's inventory under sort of three different trajectories. The first trajectory is a historical trajectory from 1990 through 2013. The second line on here is this gray line, which is the status quo. So this is a future in which Pennsylvania makes no changes, in which there are no new policies enacted. In this CO2 inventory, Pennsylvania emissions in 2013, the most recent year for which we have data available, are about 15% lower than their peak in 2005. In both the status quo scenario and also our zero emissions trajectory, which is this red line here, we achieved 25% emission reductions from that 2005 peak by the year 2022. And in the zero emissions trajectory, we achieved zero emissions by the year 2050. The key to reaching zero emissions rests on four key strategies. First is using electricity more efficiently. Second is electrifying end uses in the residential, commercial, industrial, and transportation sectors. The third is building renewables in Pennsylvania. And the fourth is incentivizing the construction of renewables in states that surround Pennsylvania, and then importing that electricity into Pennsylvania itself. So this is a chart showing energy consumption in Pennsylvania over time. Historically, most of Pennsylvania's energy, in terms of how it generates electricity, powers its cars and trucks, and heats its homes and businesses, most of this energy has come from fossil fuel and nuclear power, this gray section here. In our zero emissions case, called Pennsylvania 100% RE on this chart, Pennsylvania completely cuts out fossil fuels and nuclear by 2050. By implementing energy efficiency and end-use electrification, energy use from nuclear and fossil fuels is reduced by 35%. A further 17% reduction comes from in-state renewables, and the rest comes from renewable energy credits of renewable power in states that surround Pennsylvania. So to talk a little bit about end-use electrification first, here's a chart showing end-use energy consumption from the transportation, industrial, commercial, and residential sectors, starting historically in 1990 through 2010, and going into the future from 2020 through 2050. In the future, each year contains two sets of charts: the reference case, sort of status quo, and the 100% policy case. In 1990, emissions from these sectors represented about 60% of all of Pennsylvania's in-state emissions. Through vehicle electrification and shifting end uses like heating, water heating, and industrial uses from on-site consumption of fossil fuels to being repowered by electricity, we achieved near zero end-use consumption by 2050. This one little sliver that's left over comes from on-site consumption of renewables. Next, let's talk a little bit about energy efficiency. Cost-effective energy efficiency is extremely important in terms of reducing the number of overall sales to Pennsylvania residences and businesses. In the reference case, we assume that Pennsylvania maintains its current level of energy efficiency, the same level of energy efficiency that it's doing now into the future. Meanwhile, under the Pennsylvania 100% RE case, we increase energy efficiency levels to that of the leading states, like Massachusetts, Rhode Island, and California. As a result, less electricity is required to ultimately provide the same level of reliable service. And by 2050, this electric side energy efficiency reduces electric sales by 14% compared to the reference case. Next, let's talk about renewables. This chart shows the electric generating capacity in Pennsylvania, historically in 2010, and how it changes into the future under the two different scenarios. Under both scenarios, we see a significant reduction in both coal and nuclear capacity by the time we get to 2050. In both scenarios, we also see increases in capacity, but very different types of increases. In the reference case, we do see some construction of wind and solar in state, but we also see much more natural gas built by the time we reach 2050. Under the 100% policy case, wind and solar are pretty much the only resources that are built. No new natural gas power plants are built beyond what is currently announced. In order to accommodate the electrification of all those end uses we were just talking about in the last slide, Pennsylvania requires the construction of 81 gigawatts of in-state wind and solar by 2050. And it requires, or is supplemented rather, by 138 gigawatts of wind and solar from surrounding states. These changes to the electric and non-electric sectors have the potential to have tremendous impacts. We estimate that through changes to electric system costs and fuel costs that are avoided, Pennsylvania consumers could save up to $134 billion from 2015 to 2050, with $9 billion in savings in the year 2050 alone. And we estimate that this build-out of energy efficiency and renewables doesn't just provide savings to the environment. When taking into account the electric sector alone, we estimate that there would be a net gain of 500,000 job years between now and 2050, or roughly 14,000 new jobs each year. Next, I'm going to pass things over to Justin Barnes at EQ Research, who, like I said, will be talking more about the policy pathways that we assessed in this report. And again, remember that if you have any questions, we're asking you to hold them for right now, and at the end of the presentation, we'll be opening up the phone lines so that we can answer the questions live. So thank you very much. Justin?
All right. Thanks for the introduction, Pat, and thanks for kind of introducing what the ultimate targets we're seeking here are. I think it makes sense when thinking about policy to kind of start with the current policy landscape in Pennsylvania. With respect to those four kind of scoped areas, energy efficiency, renewable energy, transportation electrification, and end-use electrification, you can see on the slide that Pennsylvania already has at least some foundation in a few of these. So you've got an energy efficiency resource standard. You have an alternative energy portfolio standard, albeit one which includes certain non-renewables like waste coal as alternative energy, which is something that would need to change. You have some pretty supportive policies dealing with support for on-site distributed generation, things like solar panels on people's roofs through, good interconnection and net metering standards. And then for transportation electrification and electrification of end uses, there are some indirect policies that apply, minor alternative fuels incentives and grant programs, indirect via emission standards, as well as for like electrification of end uses, some indirect incentives that are created via the EARs. But there's nothing kind of really targeted at transportation electrification or end-use electrification. And in fact, some of the programs that have existed under the EARs are a little bit counterproductive in terms of kind of supporting a greater build-out or the continued build-out of end uses that use fuels like natural gas. Next slide, please. So starting off with energy efficiency as one of those components, you can see that, really thinking about energy efficiency, it's made up of the things you do to improve energy efficiency in existing buildings, the existing infrastructure, new buildings through things like building codes, and then non-building energy uses, which might be things like manufacturing, electricity use, certain industrial processes and things like that. What I want to draw attention to is the bullet point number 3 on this slide here, because I think that's really the foundation for everything, is that to get the kind of levels of efficiency that we're thinking about and what Patrick referenced for other states is really, it's really necessary to say that energy efficiency, or establish a policy that energy efficiency is a priority resource in planning. That is, it's the first thing you turn to when you're thinking about how electricity is going to be supplied in the future. Next slide, please. But turning to end-use electrification, as I mentioned, there's not really much of a kind of targeted policy towards end-use electrification. There are a few incentives and programs available under the EARs for things like energy-efficient air source heat pumps. That's a form of electrification that can, provide space heating. But looking at, how you get to electrification of primarily, at least, space heating in commercial and residential buildings, water heating in commercial and residential buildings, and then industrial end uses. One thing that I think you're really talking about is figuring out how you align what you're doing in terms of energy efficiency with refocus, with a little bit more of a focus, or more of a focus on conversion to all electric end uses. And that includes, programmatic changes, the incentives. It includes orienting tax exemptions for retail purchases of fuels to apply only to electricity and not fossil fuels, as well as redesign of electric rates that are really supportive of encouraging efficient all electric buildings. There are a few other end uses that can be a little bit tricky to electrify, things like industrial process heating that don't have really super viable commercial alternatives at this point, as well as things like that maybe relate to like consumer preferences, like a preference for natural gas ovens or natural gas stoves and cooking, that sort of thing. Some of those are going to require either technological advances or kind of end-use specific approaches that kind of go beyond what you might use for kind of transitioning a mass market to electric space heating or electrified space heating. Next slide, please. Moving on to transportation electrification, I think you find a lot of the same themes that you would see with electrification in general. That is kind of this alignment of tax policy and alignment of electric rate design that is supportive of folks transitioning to electric vehicles. But one of the things that's kind of more lacking in the case of transportation electrification is the lack of a current kind of broadly available EV charging infrastructure. So there are a variety of things that you can do to advance EV charging availability. You can do it through building codes, you can do it through incentives for the creation of EV charging capability. And that's really kind of the approach that you would take to mass market, that is kind of personal and small commercial vehicles. What's required for heavier duty vehicles, your interstate transport of goods, freight, transport of freight, via semis and big rigs, will actually require some technological advances because kind of you don't have the commercially available solutions for electrifying heavy-duty vehicles that you do for personal automobiles. And kind of the same thing is true for air travel. There's not really a way right now with commercially available technology to electrify air travel. But when we're talking about going out to 2030, 2040, 2050, there needs to be a focus on identifying the places where advances can be made for that, and then facilitating their adoption over time. Next slide, please. And finally, thinking about what Pat said in terms of 100% renewable energy, we're talking about the combination of in-state development of renewables as well as the purchase of regional renewable energy credits that, operate to kind of fill the balance that in-state renewables can't or won't be able to supply. In terms of in-state renewable energy development, we're talking about a combination of customer-sited renewables like, rooftop solar panels, grid supply facilities, primarily grid supply solar farms, grid supply wind farms, and then the balance made up through regional RECs. There are really kind of two components that we focused on for, facilitating the expansion of renewable energy in state. One is this, kind of general elimination of embedded fossil fuel subsidies in all sectors, or in all aspects, and the other is proactive planning to support renewable energy development, and that's things like improvements to interconnection processes that apply to small renewables or to large renewables, finding ways to increase the efficiency of permitting, in a way that doesn't make any other sacrifices in terms of local involvement in approvals or detrimental impacts at the local level, and then kind of above all, the need to plan a grid, transmission, distribution, et cetera, that is, that can support these kind of higher levels of in-state renewable generation. So, it's a question of, in a large way, just planning at all levels to get to where you want to get in terms of overall renewable energy penetration. So I think that's it for me. I guess I'll turn it back over to Pat right now, and we'll go to questions.
Sure. So thanks for that, Justin. So that's about it for a summary of the Envisioning Pennsylvania's Energy Future Report. At this point, we're unmuting everyone. So if you have any questions, please feel free to call them out, and myself, Justin, Maya, or a few other members of our organizations will do our best to answer them. Thank you.
Hi, this is Shanta. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Great.
Can you say your name again, please?
My name is Shanta Sussman. I'm curious to know, thanks for this presentation, how you see policymakers, either in Pennsylvania or beyond, utilizing this research.
My apologies. Can you say that question one more time? It was a bit hard to hear you.
Sorry about that. My question is about how, now that you've produced this report, how you see any policymakers using this in their future, policies that they create or conversations about what to do.
Pat, do you want to respond to that, or would you send it off to me?
So yeah, I can talk a little bit about the implications for of the analysis itself in terms of the Clean Power Plan, for example. Justin, maybe after I'm done, you can touch a little bit on the specific policies that you think might be, most ready to go or of that nature. I would say that one of the key aspects of a report is looking at a future that is all about going beyond the Clean Power Plan. The Clean Power Plan has been talked a lot about as a policy that is going to result in necessary emission reductions and necessary change in the power system over the next couple of years. But to Maya's point at the beginning of this presentation, as far as Pennsylvania is concerned, it certainly seems like the Clean Power Plan doesn't go far enough. So in our reference case, we modeled the Clean Power Plan and interpreted the results, but what we're finding is that in order to achieve the kind of emission reductions that are necessary to avoid catastrophic climate change, there are going to have to be many more policies that get at those big emission reductions. And I think what we found is that in the policy case, we're able to achieve cost-effectively things like energy efficiency policies and renewable portfolio standard policies that are more or less expansions of the policies that are in place today and could be used to get at some real carbon emission reductions.
Yeah, and this is Justin. I'll add to that. So what we attempted to do is kind of starting with that existing foundation that Pennsylvania has, identifying the areas that were, say, somewhat in conflict with the goals of, say, full end-use electrification, identify the areas where there was a lack of policy or where there was kind of counterproductive policy, that is, existing tax exemptions or subsidies for fossil fuels, existing programs that have been kind of successful in other states that really would need to be deployed at a much broader scale, say in Pennsylvania, to meet the energy efficiency targets, to meet the electrification targets. So what we've tried to provide is that kind of laundry list and suite of things that could be done. That is, in the near term, updating building codes to the most recent international building codes, which are more efficient than what's been adopted in Pennsylvania. Improving the interconnection process for small generation, distributed generation, to the point where you've kind of adopted best practices. So those are just a few of kind of the long list of things that we went through and attempted to identify as options. Now, I think in reality, to get to where we've set this goal at 100% renewable energy, these are all things that would need to be adopted. But if you're looking at just a few examples of kind of near-term things that could be done, things like building codes, things like interconnection, expansion of the existing energy efficiency resource standard. Those are things that would be kind of critical in the near term to getting to the long-term vision.
Great. And then I have just an additional question. Obviously, this is focused on Pennsylvania, and we'd like this to be something that policymakers all over the country are using. I know you guys obviously just discussed how the Clean Power Plan needs to go further. Do you think the specifics included in the report are also helpful to policymakers in similar states in the region, or do you think some of the nitty-gritty is a little bit more tied to Pennsylvania as a whole?
I can field that. Some of the when we went into kind of looking at what existing policies are in place in Pennsylvania, you know, some of the things we found are obviously going to be specific to Pennsylvania, like, but I think the suite or the potential roadmap is equally applicable, you know, really in all states, in the sense that we know at a broad level the kinds of things that support electric efficiency in rate making, the kinds of things that other states have done that are, you know, that have made the most progress in electric vehicle or in vehicle transportation electrification. So, you know, at a high level, the kind of category of policy is applicable in any state, at least in most cases, whereas we've attempted to identify some of the individual details of Pennsylvania policy that would need to change. So that's kind of where the Pennsylvania focus comes in.
So this is Pat, and just to add on something there, I would say that in general, many states have started and have, you know, already made great strides in achieving significant emission reductions from the electric sector. And I think in most cases this has been done because the electric sector is the area that, the one single area that produces the most carbon emissions out of all the other sectors. But we're starting to get to the point that if we really want to achieve or really want to avoid catastrophic climate change by 2050, we're really going to have to start thinking hard about these other sectors that unfortunately have, in many cases and in many states, been neglected up to this point. Something like 83% of all energy use in Pennsylvania, for example, came from sectors outside of the electric sector, and 60% of all emissions came from the residential, commercial, industrial, and transportation end uses. So there is still a significant piece to go there in Pennsylvania and in all states, and real effort is going to have to be made there soon, and we're hoping that this report can serve as an outline for Pennsylvania for sure, but also for all the other states in trying to make strides in these arenas.
That makes sense. I guess one follow-up there that I was just interested in is obviously to avoid kind of the catastrophic change that we're concerned about, we'd like to make progress on all of these issues. But to Pennsylvania legislators who are probably a little bit torn about getting anything done on this issue, is there something you think they should turn to first? Is there one policy priority that if we were going to legislate something tomorrow should be the top one to get accomplished?
I think there's a lot of different options you could choose from, but just to pick one, for example, is energy efficiency. Energy efficiency is far and away the most cost-effective resource for providing megawatt hours, or in energy efficiency's case, for avoiding megawatt hours. One other aspect of energy efficiency that I feel like should get talked about more is the fact that energy efficiency is great at providing local in-state jobs. So we did a jobs analysis as part of this report and found that on average 14,000 new jobs could be added every year in the electric sector, including energy efficiency, as a result of our renewable scenario. So to the extent that legislators and other policymakers are concerned about the benefits of these policies beyond avoiding climate change and other environmental benefits, energy efficiency by itself it can be a huge boon in terms of creating new jobs and new opportunities for folks in Pennsylvania.
Yeah, I totally agree with Pat on that. I mean, energy efficiency is right now the absolute lowest hanging fruit there is, and that's the kind of clearest place to start. And
just to say one more thing about that, Pennsylvania is utilities in Pennsylvania are making strides in terms of implementing energy efficiency, but they have a very long way to go before they're at the level achieved by leading states. And I think this is a really important thing to consider. This isn't some hypothetical technology that might exist by the year 2050. This is real stuff that's getting done by Pennsylvania's neighbors today, and is a real opportunity that in our reference case and in the status quo, Pennsylvania policymakers are really unfortunately leaving it on the table. Any other questions? So I think hearing no more questions, I think we might start to wrap it up here. If you do have any further questions, please take note of our information attached at the end here on this contact page, and feel free to email any of us with questions about the report you might have. Our report is going live today, and you'll be able to find it both on Synapse's website and Delaware Riverkeeper Network's website later today. So I think with that, we're done, and have a great day. Bye.